and share them as part of our Communiversity library later. So great, now I've hit the record button and here we are. So I'm a visual artist, and I've kind of approached both the Kansas native tallgrass prairie ecosystem and learn more about prairie conservation and the people that do the conservation and restoration work here by way of the visual arts. I'm a trained visual artist. I did my MFA at Kansas State University here in Manhattan, and I've just kind of fallen in love with the prairie ecosystem. So that's the way that I come to some of these questions and these conversations. But Gwen was actually the first one that sort of introduced this term rewilding to me because of some of the work that she does, and she's going to share about that with you here in a moment. But just, I wanted to kind of preface this because it's my fault that we got into this whole thing in the first place, because I was really fascinated with the concept of rewilding and just the notion of sort of like humans as the sort of dominant species on the planet, sort of reintroducing this way to be less dominant, so to speak, and just the concept of like exerting this control in order to have less control over an ecosystem, a place that we've altered. It's just sort of a fascinating concept to me in general. And I wanted to approach that as a visual artist. I've made work in response to this idea. I've shown work in exhibitions as part of this idea. But the more I talked to Gwen about this, there were some interesting and challenging ideas involved in what rewilding actually is and really means on the ground, and it was challenging to me as someone who wants to find ways to participate all the time. But the more we talked, there were specifically some challenges, I think, in terms of scale, in terms of wealth and power, and in terms of being a middle-class individual living in the United States. These are kind of this. So talking with Gwen about what rewilding is and means kind of changed my perception of how I can participate in conservation efforts globally. So that's kind of my teaser to this. And if you're hooked, stick around, because the next slide is going to be Gwen introducing what the heck this word actually means. Gwen, take it away.
Thank you all. And I think it goes without saying, but we invite you to be interactive with us throughout this presentation. If you have a burning question that you think you want to just bring up right away, that's fine. We will leave plenty of time for conversation after kind of the formal slide presentation, but we want to make sure we capture your questions. So if something comes up, please ask us either here or in chat if you don't want to speak up, and we'll be able to capture that and hopefully cover it, or say we don't know, especially in my case. I don't know, but we will find some answers for you, I hope. So this slide kind of speaks to the sense of loss. And I've worked in conservation now for a couple of decades. And I think most of us entered the field, at least from the people that I know. I come from the marketing and fundraising side. I'll just qualify right away that I'm not a biologist or scientist. My husband is, and I know he's watching, so I expect that he'll make some corrections. We might call him into the room with us. But my perspective has been built on the history of growing up in the Great Lakes area. I grew up near Cleveland, Ohio, and spent my time outdoors in nature as a child in our river system. It's a Rocky River reservation that is fondly referred to as the Emerald Necklace, around that mistake of the lake that I grew up hearing about, and was just pretty distressed as a kid, always hearing that the river was burning, and it was kind of this tongue-in-cheek way if you introduced yourself, like, oh, that's where the river burned. And I found myself experiencing that all throughout college, and then going into the environmental arena, and really started deeply thinking like, okay, what is the loss of nature that was being experienced in that urban area? Obviously surrounded by a beautiful green space and an amazing freshwater lake. And I learned more about this from my most recent experience at Tompkins Conservation. So the loss of the wild is kind of the crux of why I chose to get into environmentalism, conservation in the beginning. And today the the wild ecosystems have been reduced to a mere quarter of the planet. Intact functional ecosystems are now rare, and possibly covering as little as 3% of the earth. And so what I learned about the wild, and the why behind people like Chris and Doug Tompkins and other environmentalists and ecologists and risk takers around the world are even considering the challenge and the stress and the controversy of rewilding, especially species, when we're talking about apex predators, it is because of this loss. And we hear over and over again, I live in the middle of the Flint Hills in a conservation landscape. And I was just telling Kelly this last week. I went up to Manhattan to meet with her, and I'm driving up 177 through the Flint Hills. As soon as you start seeing the houses being put on the top of hilltops, and the forestation that's taking place at a rapid pace, it's almost this innate feeling, or this stress that I feel like, oh my gosh, we're going to lose it. We might lose the Flint Hills. And I won't go into like my Edward Abbey loving biologist husband and what he tells me about what he thinks will happen to the Flint Hills over the long haul. But there are people who are committed, obviously, preaching to the choir here a little bit, who are dedicating their lives and their mission to rewilding and conservation, and looking ahead at not what is happening necessarily today, but what this will look like in 100, 150 years, 200 years, beyond our own lives, and the impact that we can make in a positive way. So we know that we're up against the 6th mass extinction, climate change, global things like global pandemics, the stress of that. And now we're starting to hear more in the mainstream of people saying, look, like we're starting to experience tremendous impacts from storms and hurricanes along the coast, and worldwide flooding and drought. And so when you start hearing of that more in the mainstream, I think there is more of a turn toward, okay, so what will we do to preserve species, landscapes, and frankly, ourselves? I think that's a big question. And when you talk to the young people in the world, there's some worry there, and like what will be there for them, that we leave as a legacy in our generation. So we know that something must change. So Kelly, I think we could go to the next slide. So our answer, one of the solutions we think is rewilding. And I'm going to go a little bit into the history of rewilding itself, as I learned it. Deep ecology is an environmental philosophy that was first brought up by a philosopher and scientist named Arne Naess. And the core principle is the belief that the living environment as a whole should be respected and regarded as having certain basic moral and legal rights to live and flourish, independent of its instrumental benefits for human use. That gets into some really tough challenges. We know that this isn't easy to do. But I love that it argues that the non-vital human interference with or destruction of the natural world poses a threat, therefore, not only to humans, but to all organisms that basically constitute the natural order. So I think Arne Naess's, the way that I interpret his philosophy and his actions, is that there is a collaboration that needs to take place, and needs to take place at an unprecedented level, that we are nature. if you listen to our language that we use, a lot of the times we'll say, we'll own the world, right? We'll say our world, or separate out nature so easily and so quickly that, you know, it's the moose that was interfering in my territory when I was enjoying my glass of wine at Shadowcliff. And, you know, that bison that we're putting into a prairie landscape is somehow separate from us, but it's really not. It's a part of nature, as are we. And so what is the purpose of rewilding? And I think it's to get back to some self-regulation and self-sustaining ecosystems, so that things are ecologically dynamic. We know that in many cases, we can't go back to the natural way that things were, but we've seen amazing milestones in progress in reintroducing apex predators around the world. This is a global effort, and what results when nature is flourishing. So Kelly, I think next slide. So this is just an example of one of many groups that worked on rewilding and still do today. Tompkins Conservation is a conservation group that was led by the late Doug Tompkins, who tragically, but also in a sense of heartwarming as well, is what I've heard from the people who knew him best. He died on a kayak accident in one of the national parks that he and Chris were able to secure for the people of Chile.
Poetically, you poetic.
Yeah, it is poetic. And you know, it's when you talk with the team in Chile, and you learn that the puma sits next to Doug's gravestone in the park, and they're able to capture that at different points, you kind of realize, like, wow, there's something going on out there that is the magic of nature that sometimes we ignore so easily and get caught up in being too busy to notice it. So this is just an example. Chris and Doug decided to take the wealth that they had made in their careers. Chris was the CEO at Patagonia, founded by Yvon Chouinard, who was one of Doug's best friends. And Doug was the founder of North Face. And before that, he ran Esprit clothing with his ex-wife. And this is, I mean, it's pretty interesting. These aren't the, I know we're being taped, so if this goes on NPR, I'll probably get in trouble. Chris and Doug aren't the easiest people in the world. Doug had his way of doing things, and his vision early on was that he wanted to change the way that clothing was produced, distributed, and consumed in the world. That was his mission when he was at Esprit. And he quickly realized in the fashion industry, there was no way he was going to be able to take that on. The profit was, you know, profit and corporate focus was so great that he's like, I'll spend my life just beating my head against a wall trying to change the fashion industry. So when he left and sold North Face, he decided, after the times that he had visited Patagonia and saw the pristine nature of that landscape, that he would take all of his wealth, and Chris decided this as well, and they would put it all into creating national parks and turning them back to the people of Chile with the national government. And then that quickly spread into Argentina. The challenge here is that even though 15 national parks were created or expanded, and this equals 14 plus million acres, this is a scale that is just, you know, the largest on earth is what we know is how when they created this. They were able to purchase this. They were accused of being spies. They were harassed all throughout the 80s and 90s when they were doing this. Their houses were bugged. You know, it wasn't an easy task for them, not to say that, yes, they had this enormous amount of wealth that they generated. It was, I think they spent about $400 million of their own wealth and putting this into purchasing the land to create the national parks. But one of the cool things about this, so with those challenges and they were accused of being, that colonialism ruled here. These are white, wealthy people coming from the United States and purchasing land in South America. And there was a lot of concern, were they going to steal water rights? Were they taking land from people? What about the rights of the land? What about the rights of the people who live there? And so it's interesting. The more I got to know Chris, I asked these hard questions, and those questions are still asked today. The young people coming into Tompkins Conservation or into the company Patagonia, that's a sister organization, will say, like, isn't this colonialism? Like, what are you doing in Chile? We hear there's a new national park coming up again. Like, how many national parks can you really create? And Chris's answer to that, and I think Doug's as well, is that, look, if not us, who else is going to do this and take the risk and put your life mission toward protecting and preserving these natural areas that are mostly pristine and replacing the species that have gone missing from the landscapes at this scale? This is a globally significant scale that they've basically been able to accomplish. And Chris still deals with that challenge. She'll say, absolutely, we need to change. We actually need to change the economies. We need to change how capitalism. She's like, I can tell you I walk the walk. I wear the same Capilene shirt that I know was created in a sustainable way at a company that was that's Patagonia. And I wear the same clothing and I don't overconsume. But yes, I had wealth and I put it toward this mission of creating national parks. So not an easy road to go down at all, but it doesn't stop her. I think after Doug died, and I'll quote her, she said that was the day that her gloves came off. She is willing to go head to head with the super corporates. We just learned a couple of months ago that Argentina has banned unsustainable salmon fishing and industry from its country and its marine protected areas. That is unheard of. And now Chile is looking toward that as well. And that can be scary, right? Like these are folks who are going to have to deal with some probably big threats from corporations and huge commercial fishing in order to protect those areas. But it is on the docket to create the next largest marine protected area around the coast of Chile. So it covers the whole southern tier of that area. And that was one of the projects that I worked on with the team there. So I'll stop there about Tompkins, but the record's impressive, but I don't want to make it seem like it was this easy way to go for a couple that used their wealth to create these natural areas. Mm-hmm. Any questions real quick before I jump? Okay, so this next map, I don't know if you can read all, it just shows you a little bit of the impact with the species restoration and species reintroduction throughout the whole country of Chile because of the work of Tompkins with donors, with partners, with other nonprofits and the Chilean government. They were in essence able to protect most of the country, the terrestrial country of Chile, with the enormity of this park system. And so you see it looks kind of like a trail with the species icons that run down the map. And that absolutely is the purpose there. It's taking the risk to be able to create those corridors and to extend throughout the whole country of Chile. And a lot of that is driven by tourism. There's an enormous amount of tourism in Patagonia, especially, and the local people, those who could not find their papers or had their papers for their land tenure, their land title. Chris and Doug were able to secure that for the private individuals as those parks were created. So that was kind of their response to, look, we're not here to scoop up people's land. They're not even sure they can find the title to their land. So it will be owned by someone else, could be the government, could be others coming in to take over. And so their answer to that was to secure title for the residents of Chile, and then to also create the national parks and help sustain those local economies with people from the area who work in tourism. They work as park guards. They work for Tompkins Conservation. And they work in different trades in the area that Tompkins supports so that they can sustain a local economy. Okay, next one, Cal.
Okay.
Kelly, this is you.
Okay.
We're going to go into scale because we talked at the really huge level here.
So to summarize here, Gwen has lots of experience working on big projects. So I don't know that you explicitly said it, but she worked with Tompkins Conservation, and before that she was with the Nature Conservancy, and basically your like region was Central and South America, right? Was that true?
Yeah, Central, South America, and Mexico.
Yeah, just casually, all of that. So Gwen's got experience both looking at these very large scale places, large scale projects, and working with large scale donors too. I do not have any of that experience. And so this is part of why I thought this would be an interesting conversation, because we're coming at this not only from different fields, different types of work, but also pretty different scales too. So I wanted to, well, actually, let me ask you real fast, Gwen, to define just in terms of scale, what is, well, I'll say this. Let me give this quick illustration. I mentioned earlier that I first heard the word rewilding from Gwen, and I remember it being in the context of a conversation talking with her about her and Brian's like small bison herd, and how they were trying to remove some fences from land and nearby land so that the bison would have more space to roam, more like what they historically would have when bison were all over the US and roamed freely without fences. And I brought this up to Gwen recently, that memory, and she was like, oh, well, that's not technically rewilding. And I was like, what are you talking about? So Gwen, can you just briefly tell us, why is scale important for this rewilding work? And how do you know when it's been accomplished at that proper scale?
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Kelly. I think, Brian and I have these conversations all the time. It was when I was with the Nature Conservancy that I moved to the Flint Hills of Kansas, and fell in love with a man first, and then fell in love with the land of the Flint Hills. And immediately we had a neighbor, a friend who's a rancher, who said, it's my dream to have bison out here. And we're like, well, we'll do it. We believe in the conservation ethic. We want to see, the animals that have gone missing from this landscape present again. So when we're talking rewilding at scale, and this can be a little controversial, but I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there. It has to be based on the science, the best science that we know, and what it means to have a viable population of, for example, and I'm going to go away from bison for a little bit. We're considering the reintroduction of mountain lion up in the Northeast. And so what is a viable population of mountain lion? And when you're talking about urban centers and people with guns from Montana all the way up to Vermont, who may, find sport in shooting mountain lion, what can we do? And when we're working with the scientists, they tell us, like, well, if you can establish 150 pair safely of mountain lion, you've got the beginning of what we think is the core population that will then reconnect through Appalachia and possibly to the west as time goes. But first, what has to be done is the social and political studies. So we go from, it's a parallel run. You're running with the science about the ecoregion, about the species, about the viability of a population, but you're also running with, okay, what are the political barriers? What's the political will from all of the states that could be impacted by this? And you go that way. For us, it's a very small scale. Brian and I have a herd of 15 bison, and it comes with massive daily challenges. There are things like disease that can be spread from cattle or tick-borne diseases, which we dealt with our bull in the bison herd a couple of years back. He survived, but really stressful. And it's the daily, Brian and I put up well, Brian did, I better not take credit for this, he's listening in, put up a perimeter of electric fence, because the herd had broken through during a storm at one point, and our whole bison herd, the small herd that it is, was traveling north to the next neighbor's ranch, and after that the highway, right? So these issues with conservation and implementing with wild animals that we do, I don't want to say it's not rewilding, but it's at such a scale that we see it as more of an educational benefit, our own passion for doing what's right on the land, and knowing that it's not really truly our land, right? We're there for a very temporary part of time. And I think the most exciting piece of this to me is that other ranchers have begun putting bison out. And so these are traditional cattle ranchers, who now are looking toward putting a wild animal on their very large ranches. And so to me, it's kind of like, okay, cool, maybe we can be a little bit of a nugget of a catalyst to influence others. But I think, Kelly, you'll go into APR later and kind of more of that massive scale of what it means to get the species that are missing in the US on land.
Yeah, and so it sounds like, I mean, it is sort of a species specific question. It's a ecosystem specific question too, in terms of scale. But for the most part, when we're talking about rewilding an ecosystem, we're talking about landscape size and beyond. I mean, like, we're talking big. We need to consider big and look at individual species and sort of like, you know, introducing the proper apex predators into the system so that it can become sort of this self-sustaining thing again, right? That's sort of the ultimate.
You've got it. You've got it. And, you know, you go back to some of what Arne Ness says and others who are in the deep ecology movement and supporting it, trying to figure out how do we really make these massive changes. It's changing how we think of things, right? Like when we think of the United States, we think of a geopolitical boundary. When I think of bison and a sustained region of roaming bison, I'm thinking, okay, from Canada down through the United States, down into Mexico, what does that connectivity look like? And it's a difficult question. It scares people, but we created the geopolitical boundaries. So a bison doesn't know the difference between Kansas and Oklahoma, but we have, you know, private land ownership and fences and geopolitical boundaries that we've set up that hamper that, you know, true freedom of movement. But I think it is exciting that people at least are considering putting out wild animals, and making sure that they are part of the landscape. We see an increase in that, so it's a good sign.
Yeah. So that's a good segue actually into some of the next few slides here. So I'm going to share a little bit about my very different work, a little bit that I do here in Kansas related to the arts. And I'm going to share a little bit about the Tallgrass Artist Residency, which is a program that I started several years ago that it really invites artists from all around the country at this point to spend time doing research and making work in the Flint Hills of Kansas. And this slide just kind of briefly shows you a little bit of that scale on the map of sort of the Flint Hills portion of the Tallgrass Prairie ecosystem. And there's a couple of spaces on the map here. There's a teeny tiny green speck that represents Kansas's largest partial of public land, which is the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, but which is kind of a partnership, a public-private partnership with the Nature Conservancy. And Gwen's husband Brian has been hugely involved with that site there. So the original footprint of the prairie was much larger than this. You can kind of see an inset of a map of the United States in that lower corner there. And you know, that little green blob is like roughly what's left of the Tallgrass Prairie right now. It is a hugely altered landscape. So this is a really special place to live and sort of study the remnants of this ecosystem. And the Tallgrass Artist Residency program is centered in this teeny tiny community called Matfield Green, Kansas, which is kind of smack dab in this green blob of tallgrass prairie. And oh, you put in the, oh, sorry, I should have put a slide before the map because this
No,
was
that's
your
okay.
bison slide.
That's
Are
okay.
these your bison? Do you know them?
They
personally?
are. That's, yeah. We just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of what we see when we're out in our backyard.
Is one of
In the
those
backyard
Spike?
of the prairie. Yeah.
Is Spike in the front?
I don't think that is Spike. I think,
Okay.
no, I don't know who that is.
He knows he's bison. Anyway,
You
back
should
to
not name
Tallgrass.
you should not name your bison, right?
Okay, yeah, right. So Matfield Green is a really tiny community of about 50 people, and a lot of the work that I do in the arts is also sort of related to rural communities, and it's interesting to me to hear Gwen talk about some of these concepts of rewilding and reintroducing these species and sort of considering the mix of players in these ecosystems, because in some ways, like I think rural communities and vitality are also an interesting way to look at ecosystems and communities and vitality. This little town has been through different chapters. It's always been quite small, but it actually has the BNSF rail line goes through here, and it's apparently the second busiest rail line in the country or something, which is crazy for a tiny town. It doesn't have a stop there, but there are always trains going through, so there's always this commerce and this movement going through town, even though the town itself doesn't really like benefit from it necessarily. This whole county doesn't have one stoplight. There's not a grocery store. There aren't technically any brick and mortar businesses in this town that are open, but there are a number of Airbnb guest houses, and there is a remarkable thriving arts community. So this is a really kind of unique site. And I have several slides in here that I realize a lot of them have to do with food, locally grown and produced food, both from gardens and from ranches, and gathering for conversation around food. And that to me is a really interesting ecosystem in itself. There's a number of practicing artists in town and people that are basically owners of some historic spaces that they're using for arts and culture programming or to share with the community. This image on the left is a historic bunkhouse that's right on the rail line, and it was built to house Mexican migrant workers on the railroad back in the 30s and 40s. And these buildings existed like all across the state, but this is one of the only ones that's actually left. And the current owners have renovated it and turned it into some Airbnbs. And this is actually where we house visiting artists when they come to town to stay. So they're embedded in the community, both in the physical structures and amongst the people that live there, and embedded in the larger Tallgrass Prairie ecosystem. So this is kind of some of the work that I do that I like to like nudge into the conceptual rewilding kind of in this way, even though I know it's not technically rewilding, but yeah, more gathering around food and conversation and art and culture here. Okay, so the other the next sort of interesting challenge that we brought up was this concept of wealth and power, and sort of as Gwen mentioned a couple of times, with these bigger projects and these bigger players, there's a lot of wealth involved here in order to make these big sweeping changes, and that comes with some with its own unique set of challenges and maybe moral quandaries, shall we say. And I'm wondering, Gwen, if you want to just talk a little bit about the nature of this work. And I would say too that, like, as we go through here, we're each kind of presenting some concepts from our different perspectives. But these things are meaty. They're not obvious and they're not easy. So we're not like necessarily endorsing all these as the only way to do things, but it's sort of presenting our experience. Let me see, what do you want to talk a little bit about?
Sure. And I talked a little bit about this before I touched on it. So in the map with the Chilean example, but there are definitely examples of this in the United States that I can speak to. There's the where you saw the species kind of roll down the coast of Chile because of the national parks and the different species that have been rewilded in that region. We call it Ruta de los Parques in Spanish, or Route of Parks. And so I've been meeting with folks in Texas most recently. There's a group there working on connecting the big springs. So looking at two of the major big spring sites throughout, it's basically connecting Austin, San Antonio, and other parts of Texas with those spring sites, those natural spring sites. And so there's influence here from the owner of Whole Foods, who is really interested in the sourcing of food, obviously, and organics and working toward this. But what they're looking at now is the bigger picture and the cultural connectivity and the natural connectivity of Texas in this area. So this is just to say that we're starting to hear more and more conversations that even with those major influxes of wealth that helped create some of the really large landscape natural areas by putting up the funding, basically, for the new national park in Chile, the private investment for the acreage was $20 million. And we had to secure that from some individuals. It's what happens after that's really interesting and exciting. The local communities are starting to adopt then these trail systems and working in that landscape toward more of a conservation ethic, whether that's growing food like Kelly showed in Matfield Green, establishing micro businesses like the bank art space where tourists come and visit and buy local art. Or local restaurants. We see wineries that are starting to be organic, locally owned in the right places. I mean, it's pretty exciting. Like those economies are starting to take off, and we hope flourish because of these networks. Well, one of the reasons is having this network set up to begin with. So it's pretty exciting to see what's happening in the Flint Hills now. Just pulling it a little bit closer to home. Think I heard Brian say this, that 30 years ago, William Least Heat Moon was in the area and wrote a book, Prairie Earth. And when he came back, and well, first he said he would never come back because it was not a welcoming place. It was really difficult. There were death threats made against the administrators who were trying to and the funders trying to put together the national park, the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Strong City. Initially, it was a 100,000 acre landscape that conservationists were looking at, and they reduced it down to the 11,000 acres that are at the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve and part of the Tallgrass artist residency. But it's that kind of difficulty that people have to get through in order to get these networks to thrive. And I think it is happening. I think with younger people deciding to move to areas, Kelly. I mean, this is exciting. I remember when I first came to Chase County, I met with a local young rancher, and he was on his way out. He's like, look, I can't afford to take the ranch from my parents. Nobody wants to do that. I have young kids. The school system isn't great for me to put the kids in school here. I think we're going to leave. And they were thinking of moving up to Manhattan. And we talked with him about, like, look, if you leave, there isn't, your ranch will get subdivided, and in its place is going to come 20 to 30 to 50 homes in subdivisions with concrete and roads, and is that what we want the Flint Hills to become? Like, how can we help you as conservation organizations or neighbors or people who can get involved in the school district, things like that, like so that you will stay and be dedicated to ranching and to more of a local economy here. And he did stay, and they have young kids and work locally, work in the restaurants locally, and provide beef sustainably to places. So it's kind of cool to see that with the next generations coming.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, Gwen. This is sort of a tough one, but well, you talked a little bit, I think, when we last spoke about differences between trying to do this rewilding work with like Argentina and Chile, for example, because of the differences in culture and the differences in government. And, the fact of the matter is sometimes that if you're looking globally and trying to do these large scale projects, you're working with governments that may not be very friendly to democracy, etc.
Yeah.
And how I don't know, how does that sit with you?
And it's been tough. I mean, it's been tough here at home. Congratulations right now for Bears Ears again, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, we look, I think at the individual level and at the citizen level, there is a deep, deep yearning and love for nature, whether that's healing in nature, and making that a part of your own personal experience every day. I mean, we had people visit our small part of the Flint Hills because they were really, really stressed out when the riots were happening in Minnesota and Oregon, and then some risks in Kansas City. They decided, like, hey, we want to get out to the prairie to heal. So I think there are ways to engage with people to be involved in conservation and rewilding at that individual level, without having to put up, the 20 million it takes to build out a national park. But the political will is absolutely necessary. These aren't, individuals can have the mission to move forward and to say, for example, the Nature Conservancy is going to build out a partnership, or a national park, or a preserve, a private preserve. But honestly, they need that public-private partnership to make it go forward. Without the political will, things could just get really ugly really fast and not be successful over the long haul. I think the durability of having national parks or natural areas moving forward absolutely takes the public-private partnership.
Okay. Well, so on that note, I wanted to share a couple of projects. This is by no means comprehensive at all, but just a couple of examples, again, from like the art world of like, well, what can artists do, or how can art participate in sort of this when the playing field is so full of big players with wealth and power, like how. So I was kind of taken with a couple of examples that I have encountered before. This is a fun one. I like the title of this article just because it's from Vice and they can do things like this. But basically, this Canadian artist, Peter Von Tiesenhausen, has a novel approach to dealing with assholes from oil companies. He claims his land counts as copyrighted art and charges them $500 an hour to meet with them. So there have been a number of creative approaches to stopping some of the oil pipeline initiatives here, but yeah, this was an interesting one. This guy kept having developers and oil companies showing up at his house and like, pressuring him to sell. And he was kind of like, what can I do about this? And he was an artist. And so he copyrighted this fence and figured out through some legal loophole that if he kept adding to the fence little by little over the years, it could become a copyrighted artwork. And then he charged people to meet with him, which is it's kind of funny, both like a physical fence that does nothing to actually keep anyone out, but he's built this sort of legal conceptual fence that is much more effective. And this is kind of a common theme in a couple of these examples, is getting legally creative. sometimes that's, you gotta speak the language that you're you're trying to reach with of the audience you're trying to reach, right? This is another interesting example. So this artist, Aviva Ramani, started this project in 2015, again, sort of to disrupt some oil pipeline work that they were trying to dig in this, I think it was sacred land, is protected land, or they were trying to protect it. So basically what she did was she got some volunteers to use this this non-toxic natural paint to make these marks on trees in the physical landscape, and she then used the locations of these marks to create a map, and then put those on a score of music to create a song that she could then copyright. And somehow these legal acrobatics also led to protecting this land. And from what I understand, people can still participate in this by like adding marks to trees and communicating with her to make this sort of an ongoing project. So that's a pretty creative solution right there. This is called the Blue Tree Symphony. You can look it up online if you're interested. The next sort of piece I wanted to talk about was like, okay, this rewilding work, a lot of these projects, these big projects, are really happening in places that are not in the US. There are maybe there's some support, some funders from folks in the US, but you know, a lot of the slides that Gwen showed are in South America. You've talked about other big projects in India. So why isn't this a US focused, or why isn't this more prevalent in the US? What are our particular challenges that we face here? Before I go there, Gwen, do you want to answer that question? What are some of the, why isn't this such a thing here in the US?
Yeah, this is a tough question to answer. And we don't have all the answers to this. You know, I think there are definite successes in the US with big conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy, WWF, the Conservation Land Trust, others, you know, other land trusts around the United States. So look, we have a great national park system here. We also have a very deep respect for private land ownership and fences, and being able to create as much as you want. And we have a tremendous amount of wealth in the United States. From my experience in working in Latin America, the wealth that comes from the United States to implement conservation worldwide. When I started in the field, was about 70% funding from the US and maybe 30% from Europe, and within the other regions themselves. So we're privileged here to have a tremendous amount of wealth. It's, you know, and I'm not a purist. And so, you know, my husband and I are in Saugatuck, Michigan right now with my parents, and, you know, looking around thinking, wow, we could get a second home for the summer. And, you know, that's unheard of when you're working in Latin America. When you're in Latin American communities or in India, for example, people are, you know, worried about where they're going to get clean water and their next meal, and keep a tin roof over their heads, not even dream or think about what it would mean to have a second home. And so I think that's a real big question for all of us to consider. You know, how much is enough? Brian and I have this favorite saying about the Flint Hills: please come out and support us and love it, and buy the local meat, and buy the local vegetables, and buy the local art, and support these small communities, but don't overlove us. Don't overlove the landscape so much that you want to come and plant your second vacation home on the top of one of the hills. So we work really closely with others who are rehabbing different areas and creating, like Kelly said, these really special experiences and communities that are committed to the local community. And I think, Kelly, I mean, we could talk about John O'Brien. You know, he bought a crumbling limestone bank in Elmdale, Kansas. And I'll be very frank, the locals call it Methdale. It is a broken, economically, it is a broken community. It floods. It's very, very economically depressed. And yet the community that has formed with John coming there and authentically, he didn't build, he put down some really nice like rugs and old antique furniture and invited the community to use it how they wish. That invite and that ability to be, I would say, authentic and to be based and steeped in science versus sensationalism is where it's at. That's that kind of secret, not secret, but kind of magical space I think we all want to be in. And it's there, it is possible. Like at the individual level and at the community level, we see that happening again and again. And that's where we want to be, where you're not overtaking a community, you're not fixing a community, but you are there to be a part of it and a part of nature. So I think that's possible in the United States. I've seen it.
Yeah, I feel like one of the takeaways from this talk is kind of going to be like, large scale change is very helpful, but it's so important to listen and think at a small local scale, to understand what the right work is to do. But you kind of touched on this, but I think, you said in the US, we do have a particular culture that relates to prioritizing private property. We have a strong sense of individualism. And we touched a little bit on the bison and how there used to not be fences on their historic sort of site, their landscape, and now there's a lot of fragmentation of the landscape. So these things all kind of make it challenging, I think, to think really large scale here in the US. But there are some examples of some organizations, some entities that are trying different approaches to large scale change, right? And we put a couple of slides in here, and some of them you can speak to better than others, but these are not necessarily endorsements of these different approaches, but just to kind of describe what's out there and what some people are trying. And maybe, you could speak a little bit to some of the pros and then some of the cons too, if you feel comfortable doing that. I don't know, but the first one, this is easy. Come on, this is, about the Nature Conservancy. What's their deal? What are they about, Glenn?
So, the Nature Conservancy, by size, budget, type of measures, is the largest conservation organization worldwide. I think the key point to the Nature Conservancy I would like to bring up is that I always considered the Nature Conservancy kind of like Switzerland. If you go, the Nature Conservancy does not pick partisan, is not partisan. So you have this behemoth organization that can deal legally when there are lawsuits presented about, conservation easements or protecting landscapes, and other conservation issues. And you also have local staff working in every single state in the United States, on these different preserves and implementing science on the ground. So, without question, I can say like the majority of the support that goes to the Conservancy goes to on the ground. And that's huge. It's conservation getting done at the largest scale possible in the United States and beyond. So
do you have any idea how many acres or any sort of numbers in the US?
Oh my gosh, no, I'd have to.
Brian. That's okay.
Yeah, he might know, but it is. Yeah, I don't want to guess. When I was there, it was like 120 million acres protected, I think, globally, but I don't want to.
Yeah, I think it's around 20 million acres globally. In Kansas, in Kansas, it's something, we're just shy of 200,000 acres that we have protected or helped protect. A lot of that would be conservation easements, not preserves, things like that, but something like that.
Yeah, cool. Okay. And then so this next example is sort of a work in progress, but I learned about this through a podcast initially, but I think, Gwen, do you want to?
Yeah, so American Prairie Reserve is a fascinating example of a group that has basically kind of implemented what Doug and Chris did in South America. They started buying up land and opening it up to wildlife and species protection and biodiversity at a huge scale out of Montana. One of the challenges, and I talked to one of their advisory board members, so I think he'd be okay with me saying this. One of the challenges they've had is that they don't have local staff on the ground in the small communities. They've basically gone to the market and purchased up ranch land. So very similar to what we would do outside of the US. And so that's had a pretty challenging impact on ranchers in the West, to the point where they've started implementing local law that in certain counties you can't raise bison anymore because they're just afraid of this takeover of land. So I think they're working now more toward rancher relationships and getting folks outside of Bozeman and into the field to work with ranchers. And that is one lesson I think we've learned as conservationists, and Brian may speak up in the discussion. And I heard this from a rancher friend in the Flint Hills. Had you come to me and talked with me first about the plan for a national park, or engaging with ranchers and getting my opinion or my thoughts or just my intellect engaged from the beginning, it would have been a much smoother road to implement a national park. They felt left out. And I think that's something we all need to remember. Sometimes, yeah, Kelly, I loved your disruptive actions that are taking place, because those are near and dear to my heart, and advocating for taking out dams and stuff like that. But sometimes we forget, had a corporate entity been approached and solutions presented, or at least some forum happening, so that there's more discussion on the front end when conservation is being planned, or art installation, anything, right? I think people, if they feel more included, are more inclined to get to a solution with a diverse representation of people. So
Yeah,
APR is learning that lesson the hard way, but boy, they're making a huge impact. I mean,
yeah, that's one of those things, and I thought that was a really interesting example that this American Prairie Reserve, whatever, one of their goals beyond just buying up land was, I think, the reintroduction of bison, or this idea that having a large area for bison to roam, but the fallout of that lack of relationship building, investing in the relationship building with the local landowners and ranchers, then it ended up in this sort of pendulum swing of this law against bison. It was never it's not the bison's fault, but that's potentially what's at stake is with these misunderstandings, or the misstep of failing to cultivate those relationships, is the ecosystem players lose out, and no one wants that. But I just thought that was an interesting example. Okay, so the Savory Institute is another interesting example that I think more and more people are getting familiar with. But do you want to talk a little bit about this one, Gwen?
Yeah, I can talk, and I'm going to fall kind of to the challenge side here. And this is again, I spoke a little bit before about relying on science versus sensationalism. This is a never-ending challenge in the field of conservation. You have a lot of on-the-ground biologists, ecologists in marine and freshwater and on land, and their voices aren't always heard. and this is a tough challenge for us. Like, I come from the marketing and fundraising side where we typically are very optimistic and, you know, we can find a solution to anything. And when marketing starts driving things and buzzwords start driving things instead of the science, we end up paying for it on the other side of things. And so, I mean, I would challenge this group, like, what does regenerative mean? And when you're in a landscape like Africa and the land is completely denuded and it needs tremendous amount of restoration and work, yes, there are methodologies that Alan Savory has implemented that work. But when you're talking about a landscape out west that was not typically, for example, a sheep grazing landscape, and you're talking about putting hoof action and a lot of urine and creating a broken crust on a landscape, I challenge that. Really, is that the answer to protecting a natural area with species that have gone missing from the landscape? So I think it's a tough battle. And it is a kind of a battle. Like, I'm louder about this than my husband is. And he developed a great program. We're dealing with this right now in a forum about the Flint Hills and its wind energy placement. And he worked with an energy company that we may all be familiar with Evergy, used to be Great Plains Energy, and his colleague from Oklahoma, and they've created a program called Site Wind Right. And yes, it is working with the energy corporations, right? Like they can't leave them out of the equation here, but they're pushing on the science. Like, you have to use the science to know where to put these wind towers. And so I just beg people to ask harder questions when presentations like this are taking place, and don't take something that's put up as a before and after photo as factual. Dig and find out what that landscape is when it's shown before and after. And does that methodology work in every landscape?
I think I know I only know like a surface level amount here, but kind of this whole approach kind of revolves around this idea of like overcrowding the landscape, right? In order to like, and that will somehow, it's a little counterintuitive, but that the idea is that will somehow regenerate the sort of some of the native health in the landscape, but this whole institute, it's almost sort of like a lifestyle brand at this point. Like, if you visit their website, they have products in all these different industries. And I will say, like, after I visited the website for this presentation, I started getting Facebook ads with like, you know, like kids jumping on hay bales and like all of I mean, it's all across. So when you talk about the marketing messaging sort of like leading the way, it does, I mean, you know, I'm not the one to judge the veracity of the science behind it, but it does seem like the whole thing kind of hinges on this one maybe questionable concept, and now it's like this whole lifestyle brand.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we've all fallen to that before. I mean, I can think of a lot of folks I've followed and thought that they were, and this is in a small G realm, God, you know, like, I'm going to follow that because everyone's going that way. And then you have quieter voices in the back of the room saying, whoa, wait a second. Like,
it's exciting to think that you could jump on board with something that is presumably fixing it all, you know?
Yeah.
That's
to get a call from Alan Savory tonight. Thanks, Cal.
Okay. Hey, you know, if they can fix it all, that's great. We need all the help we can get. But the point is to like do the research, right? And like read between the lines. Don't just accept something because it looks alluring, right?
Yeah, and if you don't have the time to do the research, there are great scientists out there that can provide great voices to this.
Yes. Okay, so a couple of art examples here to wrap us up. I kind of shared some examples of like art as disruption to wealth and power. I wonder, when we talk about like these efforts in the US and how there's been a lot of ecosystem fragmentation and a lot of sort of, you know, protection of personal property and everything, are we at a point where like when we look at the US, is are maybe some of the projects that I'm more familiar with have more to do with restoration, recovering spaces that have maybe already been lost, and we're trying to reintroduce these species, or even a common theme I see in some art practices is really just connecting and bringing visibility to some of these spaces that we've taken for granted. And so I wanted to share a couple of interesting examples. And again, these are smaller scale examples, but they're interesting to me. Last month, I did a little traveling through southern Wisconsin. I'd never been up there before. I'm kind of curious in the trajectory of my life to sort of visit these different little pocket prairie places. I'm a little spoiled being in the Flint Hills of Kansas because we still got a fair amount of tall grass that I can see, but you go to other states, and I was talking to folks in Wisconsin. I was like, oh, are there any good like prairies I should check out? And they were like, oh no, I'm so sorry. We're not Kansas. We're not like Kansas. They were like apologetic about it. Made me feel a little special. But one site that I did visit when I was in Wisconsin is called Sauk Prairie. And it is a restoration project of about 6,800 acres right now, but it was formerly the site of Badger Army ammunition plant. And this served, I think, primarily during World War II and Korea. It was decommissioned after that, but it was owned by the military. People were living there, but there's also like a nitroglycerin factory, and it was like, I think, a pretty gnarly site for a long time. But in recent years, they've given this land back. Some of it went back to the Ho-Chunk Nation, which traditionally, cared for this land. Some of it went to the Department of Agriculture, and some of it went to Wisconsin State Park System. And so they actually have it open for visitors, but they haven't, I don't know what the active restoration exactly is like. It is being reclaimed slowly by the earth. There are roads that have cracks that are being reclaimed by the grasses, like you can see in this image on the left. There's still signs that are up from the military base. The entrance point, there's no visitor center or nice welcome center. It's a gate with barbed wire fence around it. So it's like, whoa, this is weird. But there are, kind of friends of groups and conservation groups that are trying to care for this space. And the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance is one group. And I thought it was interesting because they actually kind of claim this particular painting that was done by a local muralist called Sauk Prairie Remembered. And this image, on the right is that painting. And they kind of hold this image in their mission statement or their vision statement as the vision for what they are working towards. And I think it's almost a pretty close recreation of the direction that I'm looking in that photo. So you can actually kind of get a sense for like those hills in the background, I think were like the edge of a glacier or something, like there's this glacial footprint in the region. And so you can actually see kind of what maybe it's supposed to look like. So I thought it was really interesting to have an actual image to hold on to for a vision there. I also wanted to share this project by artist Lauren Vaughn, who's located in Los Angeles, and she has sort of a studio that she works through for some of these projects called the Metabolic Studio. But I heard her speak a few years ago, actually, at a landscape architecture conference here at K-State. One of her projects is called Not a Cornfield, and she's basically worked with this recovered brown site that's sort of in the middle of sprawling Los Angeles. Apparently, locally, it was known as the cornfield. It's not a cornfield, and one should not eat food grown in this brown site. But the whole project is around doing planting. They brought in a bunch of soil, and they've been slowly, actively rehabbing the soil and growing plants there. And this is sort of a temporal piece of work that changes over time. And I think the vision eventually is for it to become a public park. They did some events and some gatherings there, but it's this funny thing because people called it the cornfield, and it's a trashed brown site. You should not eat food from this. So she's kind of playing with that perception. I also included this image that I thought was really interesting from her site with this quote that says, "Artists need to create on the same scale that society has the capacity to destroy." So that's an interesting concept to me, and kind of gets back to some of these questions that we raised about scale and impact. What would it even mean to create on the same scale that we destroy? And what can be problematic about that too? There, like we've talked about, there is some value to working small and thinking locally. So kind of an interesting idea. These are just a couple examples of artists or projects that I think are more about bringing visibility to invisible or overlooked spaces or ways of movement or connecting spaces. This is an interesting group. The Walking Artists Network is just a group. It's a global network, but it's artists whose practice is based in walking. So there's all sorts of things to explore on that website. This article was talking about what it means to be an immigrant, a migrant. And moving from one place to another. We could talk all about like climate refugees and that kind of movement. The top image on the right is also another project of Lauren Vaughn's. She did this sort of, I guess we'll call it a performance, but also documentation of a project where she actually had 100 mules walking along the historic Los Angeles aqueduct to bring visibility to how water used to be carried across the landscape. And when you think of these Western really arid desert cities that are sucking up so much water, like from the Colorado, can all about that? And we think of like, this is the value of water. This is how we used to get water is manual labor and using mules. So, and then the image in the bottom corner, Gwen has worked with Andy Goldsworthy. He's also a very well-known artist who's worked across the globe, really, but has done some really interesting work in Kansas City. He really does these ephemeral sculptures using almost explicitly all natural materials that are found there. And he's sort of just gently altering elements in the landscape. And then oftentimes we'll just walk away and let them dissipate. But this was an image from an interesting body of work that he did called Hedge Walking. And the sort of art product that comes from these is often just times documentation of an action. But he's like, this is part of a video, but he's actually climbing through these hedges, which are like, would be horrible to do. It's kind of like awkward and painful to watch, but what an interesting way to move through and get to know a landscape intimately. And it's bizarre, of course, but it makes you kind of slow down and really consider what these things are, why they're here, and the landscape around them. So those are some fun examples. So this is our last slide, and we're going to wrap it up here. But I think this was, Gwen, you offered this as some of the tenets of the ethos of rewilding. And so even if none of us are millionaires, or even if we're not in the field of conservation biology, there are still things that we can examine about our own habits and the systems that we participate in, and how we can positively impact some of this work. Do you want to wrap us up here?
Sure. So I won't go on here. I'm happy to share slides with you afterwards. And I think one of the biggest lessons that that I've learned personally is being able to take the risk to do the hard stuff. And that started really young for me. I've always been a risk taker and adventurer. I can attribute that to my parents, I think, who are here with me. Even though they were probably clenching their teeth when I did things like walked out onto Lake Erie frozen with my stepdad once to look at the scenery frozen, or climbed through trees like you see Andy Goldsworthy when it probably wasn't all that comfortable or safe. I think individually we all do have the capacity to make a difference. It seems overwhelming at times, and this is going to sound a little bit funny, but take care of your conservationists and artists. I told Kelly this the other day. It takes people coming to visit us, even though we're in the middle of a conservation landscape. It takes people coming to visit to get us to slow down and to get outside into nature. And I know that sounds really odd. I could walk out the back door onto prairie 24/7 if I want, but instead I'm usually working on something that's busier at my computer and with a screen. And so we're really trying to force ourselves to get out more often and be a part of nature. So we invite you to come and be a part of that whenever you can, and to encourage others as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I know we have gone a little bit over the hour here, but I'm curious to know if anyone has any questions, or if there's anything here that really resonated with you, or that maybe you disagree with too. I would just like to know what's stuck with you.
I don't know if you can all hear me.
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Hi, I happen to be Gwen's mom. Nice presentation, Gwen, and Kelly also. That was very informative. But I'd like to mention a place back in Ohio, southeastern Ohio. It's a place called the Wilds. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of it. We went as an anniversary gift. We thought, oh, it'd be so romantic to stay in a yurt and actually sleep among the wild water buffalo and the antelope and the camels, and won't that be cool? But what was so interesting about it, on the educational tour the next day, we found out that a lot of these animals are being brought from other countries because they're so endangered there. They're in danger of extinction. And they're right there at the Wilds in the heart of Ohio, on a, what is it, a 13 square mile? 14 square mile preserve, and kind of a entertainment place, you know, that these animals are being bred and then taken back to the countries where they are being regenerated in those countries. So even in little southeastern Ohio, there are things being done to rewild the world. And, you know, when I never knew that, and the place was started by Jack Hanna, who was the former director of the Columbus Zoo. And he spent his money and had probably had fundraisers and everything for this. And I think maybe these things are happening all over the country.
It's interesting. Thank you, Jerry.
Thanks, Mom.
I'd just like to make a quick comment observation, and I really enjoyed the presentation to both of you. I'd love to get you guys up here to Grand Lake. I could use some help up here, but or we could use some help up here. But just an observation, I was in Steamboat Springs last week for a convention of our creative districts, and there are about 25 creative districts around the state, and most of them come from rural areas. And for the most part, all of the rural areas were saying, we cannot handle any more people. I mean, even to the point of counties saying, telling Colorado Tourist Office, don't advertise anymore. We can't handle any more tourists. And so now what's happening is the Colorado Tourism Office is they're no longer marketing. What they're doing is visitor or visitor mitigation, and trying to teach people when they go to communities how to react, because there's so much damage being done in natural areas now that it's really having large impact. So pandemic has lots of unintended consequences that are really having some long-term impacts here.
Wow, visitor
that's-
mitigation.
Isn't that amazing? Ken, yeah, there are people, like you hear this in towns in Texas right now with the movement from Californians into other states and urban and rural taking over smaller areas, right? With that influx of population. We're seeing it in the Flint Hills a little bit. And even with natural type of destruction, I see a loss of culture. I always get concerned, and it's almost that like missionary mentality kind of thing. I know maybe that's not a good, like, I'm not always diplomatic. I'm not against missions, but it's this, we're going to come save the people of Elmdale, or we're going to save Chase County from themselves. And I'm like, whoa, like, like, how about come and experience Chase County and understand the history here and what the people are, so that you aren't placing your expectations on a culture when you come to visit or move there. And it's a stressor. It is a stressor.
I think Kansas can learn some things from Colorado too, because I think you're dealing with things that, you know, we're not seeing yet, but we could in the near future, because we have those folks that are buying the second homes and sort of speculating on, whole towns maybe that. So.
No, and it was a common discussion last week about the community saying they are losing their communities. And even which surprised me, Breckenridge, which has been a very active town and in marketing and tourism and ski area, even they are saying they are really now starting to push back because they're losing their community, and it's changing the cultures, as you said.
Yeah. It's hard for the locals right now in Chase County to purchase homes.
Yeah.
And that's when you see that change, you know, it's like, uh-oh, like, what are we doing? So yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes to visiting Grand Lake soon. Go ahead, Merle.
I've seen some otherwise wasted land under high tension wires being restored to original vegetation, and providing land for foxes and hawks and so on in miniature quantities. It's an acre or two maybe, but it's happening. It has happened in Denver. I'm not sure who paid for it, but it was encouraging to see the attempt.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of creative, sort of pocket solutions, or like, you know, there's things like wildlife corridors, or like boxes or homes for birds or pollinators. And it kind of, it's interesting. Like, is that the playing field we have here, basically, is like connecting these dots, like.
I feel like I could talk to you guys a lot about this. But I don't want to take everybody else's time up, but I'd love to sit down sometime and chat. And I feel a lot of passion in my heart for a lot of these concepts that you brought up, or these topics rather, of scale, wealth, and power, and the impact that has on restoring wild spaces in our state and beyond. And obviously maybe not obviously for the folks who don't know who we are, but we do that work on a shoestring budget. And I believe wholeheartedly in community engagement and education through restoration of the land. So my only thought to place in here before hopefully I can sit with you two at a table and drink some coffee is not to be scared away from the work, because it's intimidating to think about money and power and you know how hard it would be. You know, every native plant planted makes a difference, and I think that's the message we try to spread. And it really does. It really does. And it becomes something really huge over time, you know. I'm so grateful for all of these projects though. And I didn't know anything about the Tompkins Rewilding ethos. So I'm learning so much from you guys. Thank you so much.
If there's anyone
Courtney.
who talks the walk, it's Courtney Masterson. She's
Being too kind.
Courtney works at, she's based in Lawrence, Kansas, right, Courtney? But she does projects
Yep.
all over the state, really, restoration projects.
Yeah, and you know, and we absolutely could not do what we do if it weren't for people giving of themselves. I think our biggest budget for restoration thus far, including salaries and materials and everything, was $70,000. And almost all of that was for plants. So, I mean, our budget is typically 3/4 plant material and, you know, enough for everybody to eat a meal once a day. And I think that's really great. But it's also really, you know, restoration happens on lots of different scales. And I think it's really cool to see what I would love to see more folks with wealth and power doing with their money. This is the Tompkins Rewilding work is impressive. I'd love to see more of that going on in the world. And it takes people like TNC and government agencies and nonprofits all collaborating to make that stuff happen at every scale, really. So it's pretty cool.
Courtney, thank you for that. I was so excited to see you on tonight and a little nervous too. I'm like,
Don't be nervous.
Not knowing the science. But you know, yeah, you're right about the difference at every level and every scale. I think one of the examples that I saw recently was out in Idaho, and it was a program for veterans who go out to heal on a ranch.
Amazing.
And get to know the conservation behind it, right? So it's this time of peace and quiet and people dealing with PTSD and really, really rough stuff, being able to get in nature and at the same time turning around and taking that message back out to the world that, you know, they're not afraid in this natural setting when you have wolves and other wild animals going through.
Yeah. It's a different kind of fear, right? You know, these folks deal with something that they don't feel like they can control. And there's something about being in nature that reconnects us to, I mean, known dangers, you know, it's so different than, you know, the things that we don't get to control in our constructed societies, for sure. And, you know, I agree with you about the healing nature of this work. And I don't think we've had a single volunteer who hasn't taken away some sort of special feeling or at least a skill set, you know, to engage in nature. I think, I'm sure that the work by these large corporations, Patagonia and North Face, required an awful lot of volunteer and nonprofit engagement. And so it's happening in those projects too, but there's something really special about grassroots work. And I know from working with Bridging the Gap, you and Kelly both have been engaged with them. That's where we learned how special this work is in the community. So it's really neat to see. I hope one day we can do something even sort of at that scale, even one 1/100th of the size of what they're doing in Patagonia. But Kansas, if we can do it anywhere, we could do it in the Tallgrass Prairie. It's already a lot of the work's been done already.
Well, we need to get together with you, but I'll challenge to have wine with you in addition to coffee.
Sounds good. We would love that. That would be great.
Well, I'm gonna stop share here so we can see each other. And I do want to respect everyone's time, so we can stick around. Gwen, I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm happy to stick around for a couple more minutes if people want to talk or have questions. But I do just want to say thank you all so much for taking time this evening to come spend with us. And it was really great to see you all. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Uh-oh, that Brian Overmeyer is gonna stick around and tell us all the things we did wrong. Oh, no, he
Exactly.
says, great job. Thanks, Brian.
He did it before the record. He did it after the recording went off.
I'm just glad you didn't call on me more. So you didn't.
Hey,
No,
we
you,
did all
you guys
right.
did great. Yeah, you didn't need me. So. Yeah.
Oh, Kelly, thank you. This was fun.